Value-laden argumentation. Last week's video ended with a brief discussion of this philosophical pattern of inquiry that we will be learning about and using throughout the semester. There's a few things to recall about this pattern. First, it's designed to provide us with a methodological or a systematic way to approach the various readings and passages and articles that we will encounter throughout this semester, that we need some way to walk into them in a systematic fashion so that we can make sense of what's going on, so that we can find the arguments and actually understand them and analyze them. And that's what this pattern is designed to do. And one of the advantages or the upsides, the benefits of a pattern like this, adhering to it and practicing it and becoming familiar with it, is that it will cut through not only a whole lot of complicated written words, but you can also use it in one can look at things that are said on the news or during political debates or discussions you have with your friends or your employers, and whether it's a ethical value conflict or just a typical discussion that involves argumentation of any form, that having some sort of stepwise pattern to make one's way through that tends to be invaluable. And it can cut through, like in last week's video in our approach to ethics, we glanced in the direction of a sort of National Society of Engineers, like practicing engineers. They have a nice little tidy ethical code that they follow. Nurses have an ethical code. Many professions do. Social workers have an ethical code. Pretty much any profession that deals with a lot of human interaction and human dialogue, especially if there's a potential for people to be hurt by the way decisions are made or the way that the practice and the business conducts itself. If there's a way for people to be harmed or hurt, that business or profession's almost certainly going to have some form of an ethical code. It'll be a list of principles that, like we saw last week, there'll be a whole lot of values just embedded in those principles. That's where ethical principles come from, are the values that a business or an organization or just individuals that they personally hold, the things they consider to be worthwhile, like honesty, integrity, public safety. Those are the sorts of things that often appear inside professional grade ethical codes. Well, so this method can be used to walk one's way through a value conflict or a problem that occurs in relation to the ethical codes in professional stuff. Or this same pattern can be used to make sense of what politicians, when they offer their argumentation, what they might actually be saying, or what their arguments might actually be. Typically, what one will find if they apply a method like this to, say, political speeches is typically they are saying things, they do have content, but typically they need a lot more reasons than they actually provide. But those reasons may appear somewhere else, like on the politician's website or by their certain special interest groups. So you can't just write off politicians immediately because it comes up when you analyze a lot of political speeches that a lot of these pieces are missing, and you have to fill in the gaps a lot more severely than one might think. But using a method like this, you can see that, recognize it, and determine what do I need to know more about before I make a decision, whether it's to vote for a politician or to actually agree with what they're saying or disagree. And this method provides us with ways of professional grade agreement and disagreement. rather than shouting matches and screaming and hollering. That one can apply this method to things like that too, where it's everybody's upset and they're shouting really loudly. And if you apply this method to those cases, what you will soon find is you need a lot more information than just taglines tend to provide. But that's the upside of a method like this. It provides us a way, first off, to just make sense of the readings we will encounter this semester and the video content, as well as the upside is that a person can take this method, any form of written or verbal or visual argumentation. If it exists in whatever you're reading or watching, you can apply this method to it, and it will gain so much. You'll gain so much more insight into what's actually at stake, what's going on. But the only way, or the best way I have found, none better, to help people start understanding how to do this, is to just go through passages, walk through them slowly, systematically. And that means that a video like this one, it'll probably be a pretty long video, but you can always pause it, remember the timestamp where you stopped, and you can come back and watch the rest of it throughout the rest of this week. And it will be up throughout the whole semester, so if you need to come back to this video, watch it again, that's totally fine. But the only way that I really know that truly helps people understand how to do this is to actually see someone do it, the actual mechanics of applying it to real passages. And so what I've done is generated quite a few example passages. I am making no claim that these example passages will work our way through, that they contain good arguments. By no means am I saying that. All that I'm saying is that these passages are very good at showing us what following steps like this can do for us. And we will be practicing this throughout this week's discussion, as well as one can use this same method if they look at the extra credit that's available this semester. What typically is going to happen in the weekly discussions from this point forward is you'll be presented with some situation, a scenario. It may be a passage from an article, and it will contain argumentation. It could be a video, part of a video to watch. And what your task will be is to apply various pieces of this. You'll never have to apply all 10 of these at one time. By no means will you do that. But you'll end up doing, like, typically, I will ask people to be able to locate or identify the question or the questions that that the passage might be providing answers to, and those answers, the reasons, summarizing the arguments, like strengthening and weakening various arguments. And we'll be using pieces of this all semester. So if there was ever a video to really pay attention to and take whatever time, however long this video turns out to be, this is the one to pay attention to. And so, to get started, the philosophical pattern of inquiry, I've just given the main key words of it. But let's actually make this more useful to us, and I'll type this real time so everybody gets to see it. That when you're looking for the problem behind a passage, and what do I mean by passage, first off? Well, it's just going to be some group of sentences. Like, notice, this is just single quoted. It's just a set of sentences. And so the first thing to do when you approach a set of sentences that you suspect argumentation may be in play, and we'll talk more about what argumentation is. That's the title of this video, Value-Laden Argumentation. We'll talk more about arguments as we make it through these steps. But the initial step is you suspect there may be some argumentation in there. Essentially, somebody may be trying to convince somebody else, or there may be a disagreement, or there's an uncertainty. We don't know what's happening in the passage, or the people involved they're trying to work through some difficulty. That's the notion of the problem. that there will always be a reason or a purpose that somebody went to the trouble to write a bunch of sentences down and hand them off to you, me, everybody in the class, or the public at large. Essentially, there's a reason they wrote their book. There's a reason they wrote the article. There's something. They have an agenda, and their agenda is not, don't associate a negative connotation with agenda so much as it's the purpose. It's the reason that these sentences actually exist out in the world with us, or the reason that these people went to the trouble to stand up and talk for however long they did in the video recording. There's always a purpose. So when you're looking for a problem, one of the easiest questions to ask to identify what might the problem be is, one can ask something like, why were these sentences written, spoken? Like, what was the purpose? Why did they occur in our world? Like, what was the author's intent? What is their motivation? What were they trying to achieve? And I'm not going to type all those questions out. You can write them down for yourself. But, like, what was the author's intent? The author's intent. Like, why do these sentences exist? And sometimes we can identify this. Sometimes we cannot. And the thing to keep in mind, if it's a bunch of sentences about a scenario, you may want to be specific about this. What was the author or the character? What was the author's or the character's intent? So if, like in, for example, this week's discussion, we have a scenario with a person that's thinking through and, in a sense, generating reasons for his actions. And so when you're looking for a problem, think in terms of, why is this person doing this thinking? Why are they reasoning? What's at stake? That is how you can typically identify the problem. And in a class like this one, typically the problem is going to be some conflict of ethical moral values, like to be honest versus take care of one's family. That can lead to conflicts. Sometimes what we do to take care of, that we may need to do to, act based on our value of protecting our family, may include being a little deceptive. Just keep that in mind. And so that's a conflict. We value honesty. We value honesty. We disvalue non-deception. But we also value protecting our families. And so those two values can come into conflict in our own minds, where we have to think that out and work that out. So typically, in our case, it'll be something to do with the ethical moral conflict of value, because this is an ethics class. It's a philosophical approach to ethics. And so if you can identify the problem, like, why were these sentences written or spoken? Why was the thinking being done? What was the author or the character? If it's a character style passage like this week's discussion, what was the person's intent? Why were they thinking in this way? What was at stake? Typically, in our case, you'll find an ethical or moral. I use these two words synonymously for our purposes. Ethical, moral, value, conflict. Like a clash of honesty would take care of family, or the value of human life versus personal choice. There'll be some conflict that's in play in almost all the things we encounter this semester, and we will see this as we work our way through the passages. Step 2 is this notion of questions. Like, how do we identify the question that a particular passage may be trying to provide us with an answer to? Typically, we have to read the passage. We read the passage, and to actually qualify that, we very carefully read the passage. And while reading it, just ask, what question, or it could be multiple questions. What question or questions is this passage attempting to answer? Normally, you can find it by just asking that. What question or questions is this passage trying to answer? Or if it's a public debate, what question is really at stake? Like if you encounter two people and they seem to be disagreeing about, for example, gun control. That's been a particularly, it comes up in cycles. Anytime there's an act of violence against other people that involves guns, debates about gun control, political debates, legal debates, moral debates, just everyday social debates, they show up. Well, the question that will be addressed typically by those debates, it can vary depending on what the people are actually saying inside the passage. The question could be something like, should we regulate guns more strictly than we currently do? That could be the question. Or are guns inherently dangerous and need to be removed from U.S. society? That could be the question that the people in dialogue with one another, or debate or argumentation, that could be the question. So the question will vary depending on the context, just like the problem's going to be set by contextual factors. The main question that the authors or the speakers or the characters will be discussing, they'll be trying to answer that question. Sometimes that question will be explicitly stated, like they'll actually say the question we're trying to address today. Sometimes they'll do that. Typically not, though. Just like the problem, we normally have to kind of piece that together for ourselves by reading or paying attention to what's actually said in the context in which it's said. The same goes for the question or the questions that a passage may be providing answers to, is that you have to be careful and look very carefully at it and just think, what question is really at stake? And we'll get examples of that throughout these passages we'll work through today. But that's just to give people a sense of the questions are not always explicitly stated in the sentences you have, nor will the problem necessarily be explicitly stated. And just another word about the problem, sometimes we can't really identify what the problem or the questions were until after we make our way through steps 3 through 4. Steps 3 through 5. 3 through 5 tend to be where we come up with the question and the problem. Typically, especially if it's just a bunch of sentences that have been tossed in your direction. The best you may be able to do initially is start at step 3, go 3, 4, 5, look at the argumentation that you found, and then go back and figure out what the problem and the question were. This is real life. As I mentioned in last week's video, this pattern is not necessarily intended to start at step 1, 2, 3. Most times, I found it easier to start at step 3, 4, 5. But in terms of organizing your thoughts and the final, once you have what you need to do all these steps, it's a good organization to put it in these 1 through 10 steps. But just keep in mind, real life is a lot more dynamic. And there's a lot of circles and loops. It's like once you get an answer here, you find an answer, you may be like, oh yeah, well that means what I thought the problem was is not actually accurate. I made a mistake. Let me go back and fix what I thought the problem was and write it out again. Or the question, I thought they were addressing one question, but after I get down here to step 6, I realize, oh, they were actually answering a different question. Then that's totally fine. You can move in and out of these to achieve an understanding of what's going on. And we have to always understand what questions at stake, what is the claims that are being made, what is the argumentation. We have to understand that before we start critiquing it ourselves. It's really easy to miss what someone's saying in argumentation. It's best to be slow, careful, methodical. Hence the reason for this sort of pattern we're following. Especially the assumption with a class like this one is that no one in here is already an expert at working with stuff like this. Some people may be very good at this already, and they will just improve as the semester goes along. But if all this is brand new to you, that's totally fine. That's the reason I'm walking through this right now. So don't let all of this overwhelm you, just take it slow. Remember last week's video, we slow down in order to go fast. That if we go through this slow and carefully 5, 6, 7, 8 times as we're reading, we become better and more fluent at it, and it becomes extremely quick. We end up becoming much more faster at taking passages and pulling what's relevant, argumentatively relevant out of them, and immediately able to assess and get to work, like analyzing, critiquing, trying to develop our own counters to it or strengthening it if we happen to agree with it. One becomes much faster the slower they go starting out. So that's just things that have been learned throughout my life working with this stuff. Okay, so maybe we were able to identify the problem. Maybe we were able to identify the question of a passage. Even if we couldn't find those two things, they'll absolutely, every passage you encounter in this class, maybe not every paragraph in an article, but the whole article, the entire article that you will have read, there will absolutely have been what's known as a thesis or a conclusion or some major claim that was driving what was said in that particular paragraph. The author will have made a major claim. Or sometimes, it can, in argumentation it's referred to as a conclusion. It's a major claim, it's a conclusion. Sometimes we refer to this as a thesis. Many people may be familiar with the notion of a thesis statement. And that is, in the context of a class like this, the thesis statement will be something like, in this article, I will argue that. We will encounter this a lot in argumentation. People tend to use the I, or the claim may not have this prefix in front of it, but if it does, that's almost certainly the major claim, the thesis statement, the conclusion. That is what the author wants to provide you with support for, that they would like for you to maybe believe is true by the end of reading their sentences, their words. Or if it's a debate, by the end of the debate, it's something they want you to buy into. Remember, the notion, people may not be familiar with the notion of argumentation as a concept, but everyone is familiar with the idea of persuasion. Like, think about what lawyers are doing in the courtrooms. That if you say we take a criminal case, well, the defense attorney is their major claim that they're always advocating is my client is innocent or is not liable if it's a civil lawsuit, or my client is not nearly as guilty of as many charges as the state or the prosecutor is accusing them of. That's the defense attorney's major claim. That's their thesis, their conclusion. That is the sentence that they want the jury to buy into, or the judges to buy into by the end of their time talking. So the major claim, the conclusion, thesis statement, whatever you want to refer to it as, typically in argumentation, we'll say conclusion or major claim. You'll see me ask for that throughout the semester, like, what is this person's major claim? And what that major claim is going to be, as soon as you find it, all you have to do is think about what question it would provide an answer to. That's how you can generate part 2 or step 2 or phase 2, stage 2 of this pattern, is if you can find the conclusion, then you just ask yourself, what question does this statement provide an answer to? And then you'll know that you got stage 2 of this pattern correct, or you'll know you're very close to being correct with it. So we look for the answer is an answer to, well, that question. Then the next thing is the reasons. In the context of this class, there will always be reasons offered in support of that major claim or conclusion. So say the question is something like, is it morally okay to abort, like abortion? Let's just use a standard example. Is it morally okay to abort this baby in a particular scenario? Well, the problem with that could be addressing will be some conflict of values, which you may not be able to identify until after you figure all these other steps out. So we won't really worry about what the problem is at this moment, but if we see a claim to the effect it's okay to abort in certain circumstances, like in rape cases, and the person's given us reasons to buy into that, well, we know that the question that's under, that's at stake is something like, would it be okay to abort in rape cases? Well, then the answer the author may provide is yes, it is okay to abort in rape cases. Well, at that point, the very next thing one wants to know is why. Why would I think that? That is the reasons. Like reasons are answers to why questions. That is the key to finding the reasons. If you can do nothing else in a passage, you can look at each and every sentence and read the sentence, think about what it's saying, and then ask why. Why should I believe this? And then read the next sentence and see if it gives you support for that first sentence. It's giving you evidence. It's giving you, well, a reason to buy into that first sentence. We'll practice that through some of these passages. But the reasons are answers to the why questions. Sentences offered in support of the answer provided in 3. So, and this is 3. So reasons are answers to why questions. They are sentences offered in support of the answer or answers provided in 3. That's what the reasons are. Sometimes they're referred to, sometimes referred to as premises. But either way, we'll be looking for the reasons. So the next step, and this is the interesting part, is once you have an answer to a question and you have reasons in support of it, then you have what's known as an argument. An argument for us is not a shouting, come on. It's not a shouting match. It's not a case of everybody just chanting some claim over and over and over. Like, no chanting. It's not what we would typically see on the news. You're not receiving an argument in those cases. People are, in many cases, just chanting or they're shouting some tagline. It'll be a few words, like abortion is murder. And you'll see that, like at protests about abortion. Abortion is murder. Abortion is murder. Well, that's just a claim. That's what it's an answer to a question. Is abortion murder? Well, if someone's saying abortion is murder, their answer is yes, it is. But they're not really providing you with any reasons. Like just saying the same conclusion or thesis or major claim over and over again is not providing us with reasons. And if it's not providing us with reasons, it's not providing us with an argument, not in the academic sense. So in the academic, or one could say professional sense, arguments are sets of sentences, one of which is supposedly supported by others in the set. That's all an argument is. They say, let's just make this singular. So in the academic sense, an argument is a set of sentences, one of which we would call the conclusion, is supposedly supported by other members in the set. So other members in the set is the other members in the set is reasons. That's all it takes to make an argument. In the academic professional sense, an argument is a set of sentences, one of which the conclusion is supposedly supported by other members in the set, the reasons. So this is your definition as far as this semester goes throughout this whole class. This is the definition of an argument. If it's helpful to people, because everyone in this class will get this document once this video is through, it'll be posted. We can set this in bold so that we don't forget it. And so we know what an argument is. That's what an argument is. That's what it means for us. And in philosophy style classes, this is what we're after. We're after the arguments. Always, always, always. We're looking for the set of sentences that has a conclusion or a thesis statement and the reasons offered in support of that statement. That, this being said, all it is a set of sentences. It's nothing more, nothing less. A set of sentences, a set of statements. Typically, they're in declarative, where it's like it's a statement. It's not a question. Sometimes, depending on the level of rhetoric, which rhetoric is just things that are meant to capture your attention, like their words, their phrases, their examples that are used, and all the reasons may not be made explicit. We'll see that as we look at passages, but the reasons may not, or the major claim, it may be left a little amorphous, but it's meant to capture your attention and like kind of rally support behind something. That's rhetoric. Whereas we're not really concerned about the rhetoric. Really, in many cases, the rhetoric can get in the way of us actually being able to find the arguments. But the arguments are what matter the most to philosophy people. And even more interestingly, is that in many cases, philosophy people and ethicists, the major claim isn't really what's interesting. Like, we already know the answers to most any ethical question that's ever asked to us, like part 2 up here. The question is always going to be something like, is it ethically or morally okay to do something, like some action? And that action's typically going to have the potential to harm somebody. Somebody could get hurt based on what we do. And not always, but typically. That's typically the note of how to figure out if it's ethical or moral. Harm is involved. And the idea is the question could be, is it morally okay to abort? Well, that we know the answers already. The answer's the major claim. How could someone try to answer a question like that? Well, the answer could be yes, it's okay to do it. No, it's not. Or maybe it is, maybe it's not. So yes, no, maybe so. Yes, no, maybe so. Typically, that's going to be your answers, your major claim, your conclusion if you're looking at an ethical, moral style argument. Not in all kinds of argumentation, but in ethical, moral, typically the overall questions will be, is it morally okay to do this? Is this a good idea? Ought we to do it? And then the answers are going to be things like, yes, it is, no, it's not, maybe it is, maybe it's not. It depends on details, circumstances. And then the reasons are what we really care about, though, because we already know the answers. Yes, no, maybe so. But what we don't know is the reasons that people may offer us to try to get us to buy into their answer, like the evidence, the data. Like anyone that's familiar with science will know your hypothesis. So that's another way. You can do this sometimes. Hypothesis. That can be the answer sometimes to whatever the question is. One hypothesizes. They're like, okay, I hypothesize that if these factors are changed or modified in some way, then these are the results I would expect. So it could be a condition style statement in science, but it's still just making a major claim. It's just a sentence that person then goes and does their experimentation. They collect their data. They do their statistics, standard deviation, all that sort of stuff, depending on the type of science it is and the type of study. And the idea is those are their reasons. That's what that data is in science. And that's what even the experimental setup, when a person describes, well, here's how I set the calibration on the machines I was using. Here's the exact model of the scanning tunneling electron microscope I used. That what they're doing is they're giving you reasons to buy into, yeah, I mean, they did their work. They did here, if you want to repeat it, here's what you do too. And that serves as a reason to buy into that maybe they found some support for their hypothesis. They found a correlation. And finding a cause, that's, near miraculous in science. And typically we just find weaker or stronger correlations, which we'll see some of that throughout the semester. But the idea is the argument in a scientific setting, for example, is the argument is a hypothesis was made. The reasons are the data that are offered in support of it, and we'll typically see all of that summarized. Like the conclusion typically appears at the bottom, the end. It's a conclusion of the results. Like we found a correlation between blah, blah. And then you could push it back and say our hypothesis was supported. I will argue that I have support for this hypothesis. And then they do that by saying, well, here's the data. See, it actually supports hypothesis. And so arguments, they're not mysterious entities. We encounter them all day, every day, and we'll see that with some of these passages. That they're not shouting matches, there's no chanting, they're not mysterious entities. In the academic professional sense, they're just sets of sentences, one of which is typically the major claim, the conclusion, the thesis, the hypothesis, whatever you want to call it. Then that is supposedly that claim is support is going to be offered for it in the form of other sentences or data, the results of statistical analysis, etc. Now, once we have the arguments, once arguments are collected, let's see, do our best to be charitable. The notion of being charitable, sometimes it's called like a charitable reading. And think about with charitable, we're giving. We are giving this person, give the author's argumentation as much as possible to preserve truth from first reason to conclusion. And we'll see this. I won't say a whole lot about it right now, but the idea is when we're trying to charitably rebuild the person's argument, like this is we collect the arguments. So let's add that. We always collect all arguments. So we want to find the major claims. If there's more than one, if there's just one, well, we get it. Then we get the reasons. We hook those things together. We try to restate them. So restatement of argumentation. So this will be something like restatement of the author's argumentation in concise words, in a concise manner. And that means we cut out a lot of the extra words, the extra sentences, or the stuff that we don't need in a passage. Like a lot of times we may encounter people debating and they say a lot of things that aren't really all that relevant. we want the reasons or the argument to be as concise as possible, as few words as possible, but sufficient words to have actually captured the argument as it appears in the passage. Then we get to this understanding, we may have to add to the original argument. Like this understanding, we're trying to understand what the person was actually saying, and we're being generous and charitable. We're giving them the extra stuff they may not have said, but they implied. That's implied by what they're saying, and it's what they need in order to actually have offered support, decent support for their conclusion. We'll see examples of how to do this below. Then, okay, so after we've created a charitable restatement of the author's argument. After we've done that, after we've created a charitable restatement of the author's argument, we analyze it. So we want to have the best argument that the author could have provided us. And then we analyze it. We ask questions like, is the argument valid? Like validity, valid. Okay, so let's do a definition here so that everyone has this. An argument is valid if, assuming all the reasons are true, then the conclusion must be true as well. If. Okay, an argument is valid when, assuming all the reasons, premises, we can do some hyphenization here, or some forward slash. When we assume, like, an argument is valid when assuming all the reasons and premises are true, then the conclusion must be true as well. So let's do a little better. That's a little crunchy. So an argument is valid, or let's see. Let's just do this. If we assume all the reasons and premises are true, and let's see, I want to give everyone a decent definition of this. If assuming all the reasons and premises are true forces the conclusion to be true, then the argument's valid. So what does that actually mean? Well, say you have a whole bunch of sentences and you've identified the reasons, you know what the conclusion is. And what you do is you hold the argument at arm's length. You don't ask, do I actually buy into this? It doesn't really matter if we buy into the argumentation. That's not what we're doing during analysis. That's, we do that eventually. But the point at this stage is to see, is the argument valid? If I were to assume all of these reasons were actually true, like all the evidence is actually legitimate. So if I'm listening to a lawyer in a courtroom and the lawyer's like, my client's innocent, the defense attorney, that's the claim, and then the lawyer provides us with reasons. Like, for example, the prosecution says my client committed this murder at a certain date and a certain time, but my client, here's a plane ticket that shows my client was in a totally different country at that time. Moreover, here's a photograph taken on a amusement park ride in that other country at the time when my client's sitting on that roller coaster. I mean, granted, something like this would probably never make it to trial if a defense attorney had this this good of evidence, good in, quotation marks. Anything could be, manufactured or fake, but we're assuming it's true. So would we think the conclusion would have to be true? I mean, just on a first glance, that if we assume that the plane ticket's legitimate and that the picture of this person on a roller coaster in this other country is legitimate and that all of that actually was taken on the date and the time when the murder was happening in a totally different country, if we assume that's true too, well, then wouldn't it seem like that conclusion would have to be true as well? Or it's very, very, very likely that it's true. The notion of that very, very likely or it's highly probable, that would be what falls into like science. Is, we never find enough data to absolutely prove something in science. Every day we talk about science proves things, or lawyers prove things. They're providing proof. But that's typically not the case. Typically what we have is we have a lot of reasons that really make us think the conclusion's probably true. But so when we talk about validity, if we were in a formal class on like what's known as deductive logic, there's a very precise definition like this. If assuming all the reasons premises are true forces the conclusion to be true, then the argument's valid. That's like a deductive logic definition, and we're not doing a formal class on deductive logic in here. We're doing more like what's known as informal reasoning about ethical and, ethical moral value conflicts. So, but that is the notion of validity, and we can weaken it like that something, it wouldn't be valid, but it's like, so we can ask, is the argument valid? But we can also ask, is the argument plausible or likely? We can do that too. And what that involves would be the same thing. If assuming all the reasons are true forces the conclusion to be very likely true, then the argument is plausible or probable, if that word is more helpful to people. So either way is fine. We want our arguments to either be valid or we want them to, at minimum, be plausible. We want to, the argument has to have these things. But notice that this is the first stage of it. So that after we've done it, we analyze it. And so some of the things we may ask here, we can break these up so they're more helpful. Is the argument valid? Is the argument plausible or likely? If assuming all the reasons are true forces the conclusion to be very likely true, then the argument's plausible or probable. That's the first stage. And this actually is in the right order. So we created a charitable restatement, then we analyze it. We're like, is it valid? If I assume all these reasons are true, must the conclusion also be true? If so, it's valid. The next, or if it's not where we can say that it must be true, or that it's just likely that it's true, like that's what happens in legal cases. Like typically we never get to the truth, like with a capital T. What we end up with is very, very likely. That's why the standard in criminal cases is beyond a reasonable doubt. Notice it doesn't say proof or truth. It says beyond a reasonable doubt. That's indicating it's very likely true. That's the kind of way to think about what lawyering or science is typically doing. Because we know that science, sometimes we think the world works in a certain way, or a cell culture, or a bacterium, or a virus, but then later we're continuing to do scientific research. Scientists don't just accept. They keep doing, they keep testing, they keep experimenting, and sometimes it could be on a totally different track, and then they once they have that together, then they say, well, yes, I have much support for this, it's very likely true. But they don't try to say it must be true. That's the difference between validity. This is typically the real world, plausible, likely. This happens in like formal deductive logic classes. But you can ask both of the style questions against any argument. And now, once we think the argument is valid, or at minimum plausible, once we think the argument's valid or at minimum plausible, we ask, are the reasons actually true? This is, see, keep in mind with B and C here, that when we're wondering about validity, we say if we assume that all this these reasons and data is true, and the conclusion is forced to be true, then the argument's valid. But another, or if we were looking for it, if is it plausible or likely, if we assume all the reasons are true, forces the conclusion to seem very likely. So we're assuming the truth of the reasons. When we get down here, what we're asking is the argument sound, cogent? That's the questions we're asking. Is the argument sound? Which means if it's a sound argument, the reasons will actually be true. So once we think the argument's valid or at minimum plausible, we ask, are the reasons actually true? If all reasons are actually true, then the argument is sound. If all the reasons are very likely true, then the argument is cogent. Cogency is just, it's like a weaker thing. It's just weaker than validity. Or it's weaker than soundness. So if all the reasons are actually true, if all the reasons are actually true, so let's highlight that. And in this case, assuming. So we'll draw everyone's attention to these notions, because they're the keys to understanding the distinction between these things. That's how we analyze arguments. We're looking for validity, plausibility, or soundness, or cogency. And that's good enough. For our purposes, that's really all we have to do in the analysis phase. I mean, there's much, much more where in a logic style classes where you get into the sort of patterns of reasoning that are there. And we'll talk about these patterns as we go along. But this is enough to get everyone started. And then now we get to the decision phase. So if the argument is valid, or it's sound, or it's valid and it's plausible, or it's valid or it's plausible. If it's valid, well then it could very well be plausible, but it may not. So if it meets these criteria and the reasons are actually true, then we can make a decision. So this is the case of, do I buy in? You know, so whatever the question was, like, is it okay to abort? Someone says, yes, it is, because 1, 2, 3, 4, they give us reasons. Then we take and we try to understand it. We give them any reasons that they didn't provide us, but they needed in order to make the argument a good one. But they have to be applied. They have to be relevant. We can't just give them anything we want, and that just takes finesse and learning. And we'll see that throughout the rest of this video. Then we reach down here. Once we've done that, we've analyzed it. The argument seems kind of likely. It seems plausible, or at least would seem plausible to some people. Then we can make a decision. Do I buy in? If not, then why not? If so, then why so? Which these two questions is, do I agree or disagree with the author's reasoning? That's what a decision. That's the decision stage. This is where, at this stage, one must offer her own argumentation. So this is where you come up with, this is reasons for why I agree or disagree with the author's argument. That's what the decision is all about in our context. During the weekly discussions, we'll be working with this, we'll be analyzing, we'll be doing these major steps. Typically, we'll be working with like steps 2 through 8. That's where we tend to operate most of the semester. But the decision, is, do I buy in? Now, the results and the sharing, if we were doing this where we were crafting our own argumentation, like notice this, I'm presenting these steps and stages in terms of how to analyze something that another person generated. Sentences or statements made by someone else. But you could just as easily do this for your own statements, your own claims, your own problems. And if you do that, when you get down here, the results are things like, say, I need to decide what to do. So my problem is I have to make a decision about whether to send troops to battle or not. That's my big problem. But it'll also be a value conflict. It'll typically be the problem is that the lives of the soldiers are valuable. I know that death is inevitable. If I send them into a conflict, it's almost inevitable somebody's going to get hurt. So I value their life, but maybe I also have values of protecting a whole nation. Say I'm a military commander, I'm a president, I'm a politician. Or say I'm like the nurse in charge of the floor, and I have to decide how to allocate my staffing resources. Say I'm the director of nursing at a hospital. I have to do the scheduling and allocate nurses to make sure there's enough to cover the amount of predicted patients we'd have at any given time. So my problem is I want to provide good patient care. That's my value. I value good quality patient care, but then I also value keeping the hospital running smoothly. Like I can't just staff 100 nurses on a floor with like 10 rooms. Because the administration, the finances of the hospital itself, I value its continued existence. So I can't just staff so many people and the hospital has to pay all these people. And so I have to be realistic about this situation. And so what would happen in a real world scenario, if you make it all the way through here, you've provided yourself, you've done your own reasoning, you've assessed your own reasoning for plausibility, etc. Then you say, yeah, I think I've got a good solution. Yeah, I'll staff for my 50-room floor of the hospital. I'll staff like 55 nurses. And then the idea is you do your decision and then your results is like, did my decision, was it a good one? So this is like, decision is like, was my decision a good one? Like if I buy into my own reasoning and then I assess it, I evaluate it. I'm like, okay, I chose this path. How did it turn out? Like was my decision a good one? Like positive, negative outcomes of deciding one way or the other. That's what results typically are. Like, we decided to do something, we did it, now we look at the consequences. Positive, negative outcomes, consequences. And this tends to, and now in the context of weekly discussions, how will this play out? The results is typically what will happen is when you share, it's like, hey everyone, look what I found. That is, like, typically you get results like you create your own argument, you buy into it, you share it to the public, it goes out in the wild, and then you get back to step 9. Like, if everybody kind of hammers on your argument and they're like, whoa, there's some big glaring mistakes, well, that would be a kind of negative consequence of that argument for you as a person who created it, and you're like, ugh, yeah, I may need to go back up to some of these other steps and do some modification. So typically, step 9 may come after step 9 may not really become apparent until after we do step 10. So that's in typical practice. And as far as we're concerned, like, what will happen is you share your steps that you work through in a weekly discussion, and then your peers reply to you, and I do in some cases, and so you get results. And then that helps you go back and do modification if you need to. I mean, you don't have to do it real time on the discussion unless you want to. To your initial post, that's just you give a shot out into the world and see what results you get back. That's what results, and then typically results happen after sharing in our context. But in other scenarios, you get results. If you're doing it a more science way, you'll get results, then you share. So that's why you got 9, 10. But just think about it. These two could flip-flop at times. Like I said, this pattern is a guide. It's not meant to be the strictest 1, 2, 3. Now, 3, 4, 5, and 6, those tend to always show up at the same time. And 7, definitely, you don't analyze typically before you understand. Like, you have to know what the author's saying before you go and try to analyze it. Yeah, so let's put that little qualification here. We want to actually understand what the author was arguing. Yeah, and so we always. Yeah, so that's just a modification. Like I said, everyone will have this. So let's fix this typo that's staring at us in the face. So that's just a quick overview. I mean, maybe not so quick, but it is me walking through this pattern with everyone. And so, just to do a quick summary, how does this pattern work? You're presented with some sentences, and what you do is you try to fill in the parts of everything that's been written under here. You use these as prompts to know what would go under 1, 2, 3, 4, and you practice this. As I said, the problem may not always be apparent until after you've done some work on the other ones below. Is attempting to answer? Yeah. I mean, that's all there is to it. And you practice. That being said, let's do some practicing.